Good morning. Glad to see everybody here. We've got a good crowd today. Got a nice day out there. Not too bad. We're studying in Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, and actually last week we just started on the first verse, and we were having some conversation about it. And my charge to everybody was to study these verses a little bit. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on the first verse again. I went back and did a little bit more studying on it. I found some stuff that I think that kind of applies here in this situation. So we'll go back and discuss it just a little bit before we move on to the next chapter. What what Moses is talking about here is people who are not born in Israel. And that's kind of the theme here of the first 8 verses. So before we go any further, I'd like for Ray Daniels, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Father, thank you for another beautiful birthday morning. Be with David, teach us one Father as the grace the truths, help us understand the things you love us, Father, keep us thankful for Christ, our Son, our Savior.
Okay, so let's look at the first verse. It says, "He that is wounded in the stones, or hath his privy member cut off, shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord." So, as you remember from last week, we were basically talking here about eunuchs, and we were talking about intentional versus accidental. And we were having some conversation at the end of class where accidental, where would that fall into the deal? First thing I want to kind of go over before we hit into this really heavy is I think that we need to understand that the law of Moses and the things that we're talking about here really can break down into 3 parts. And I think that what's being discussed here is one of those parts and not necessarily the other 2. And I think we need to keep in mind that because somebody didn't qualify to do one thing, that doesn't mean that God hates them. And I think that's an important thing we need to remember. So basically, there's 3 laws here that we're studying. The first one one of them is ceremonial law. The second one is civil law, and the third one is moral law. Now, civil laws dealt in morals, but were mostly concerned with the governance and the everyday operations of the children of Israel in their day-to-day lives. The moral laws are eternal laws. They don't change. The same moral laws that Moses set forth in the Old Testament was brought all the way through into the New Testament. They do not change. They're the same, and they don't change. The third one is the ceremonial law. And I think the ceremonial law was firm at the time, but it changed as time went on. And, we don't have the same ceremonial laws today in the New Covenant that they had in the Old Covenant. So these ceremonial laws, they change. We don't have the sacrifice system that they had back then. We don't have a holy of holies. We don't have an altar. We don't sacrifice animals on the altar. Our sacrifice was Jesus. He took the place of all of that. And the ceremonial law was very heavy emphasis on the holiness of God and the righteousness of God, and the difference between the righteousness of God and the unrighteousness of the world in general. So I think we need to understand that somebody who is emasculated is still a person who is loved by God. But in the age of ceremonial law, when God used the law to teach the differences to His people, and watching the world between clean and unclean, perfect and imperfect, holy and profane, things along that line, we couldn't let something that is, or God wouldn't let something that is imperfect be used in the ceremonial law. And that's not to say that God didn't love these people who were imperfect, and it didn't mean that they were going to be shunned and thrown out into the wilderness and left to die. That was not the purpose of this. And there are a lot of ways where somebody could be, a male could be, emasculated, but it could be intentional or it could be unintentional. So Kevin last week, brought up a very good point. He said that he wasn't so sure that somebody who was accidentally emasculated could perform these things.
Another concept. Some people were born that way.
That's kind of what we're going to talk about. So we're talking about breaches of the ceremonial law rather than the moral law or the civil law. And I think what we need to do is we need to turn to Leviticus, the 21st chapter, starting with verse 17. And this discusses the situation of perfect versus imperfect. And I think this kind of answers the question about the accidental. So let's start with verse 17. It says, "Speak to Aaron, saying, no man of your seed in their generation shall draw near or offer the bread of his God if there is a blemish in him. For no man in whom there is a blemish shall draw near, a blind man, a lame man, or disfigured or deformed, or a man that is broken-footed or broken-handed, or crooked-backed or crushed one, or one who has a blemish in his eye, or a scurvy or a scab person, or one with crushed testicles. No man of the seed of Aaron, the priest, in whom there is a blemish, shall come near the fire of the offering of Jehovah. He has a blemish, he shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He shall eat the bread of his God, the most holy and of the holy. Only he shall not go into the veil nor come near the altar, because he has a blemish, so that he does not profane my sanctuaries, for I am Jehovah, do sanctify them." And Moses told Aaron his sons and all the sons of Israel. So here we see a situation, we're talking here about the Levites, and a situation where here is somebody who has some type of deformity, some type of injury or something that would make that person what we would consider not a perfect body. And they were excluded from, even though they were Levite, they were excluded from the duties of being a priest. But we also see in verse 22 here that he still is, he's still going to be taken care of. And this is especially important here for the Levites, because they had no inheritance and they were depending on everybody else. So I think basically, if we look at that right there, that would answer our question about whether somebody who accidentally became emasculated would be able to participate in the things of the Jews. Comments about that? Agree with that, Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Whole thing comes down to purity.
Right.
God expected purity.
Right.
People.
Right.
That was one reason that he wanted to keep them from the nations around, keep his people pure.
Right.
And
And part of the reason for the rule, and this was talked about in Isaiah the 56th chapter, verses 3 through 5. Part of the reason for this rule could have been to prevent the kings of Israel and Judah from making eunuchs out of their servants. And this is discussed in Isaiah 56, 3 through 5. It said, "Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. Nor let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath and choose that pleases me and hold fast my covenant, to them I will give my house and within my walls a memorial and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which will not be cut off. So here's a situation here where, God did accept the eunuchs, later on in the deal, and that kind of goes back to that ceremonial thing again. Ceremonial law could change, but God's moral laws don't change. Other comments about that verse? All right, so let's move on now to verse 2. It said, "A bastard shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah. Even to his 10th generation he shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah." So likewise, we see here that God excludes an illegitimate child. And there's been some possible ways that this could be, number one, born out of incest, born out of adultery, or born out of the union of an Israelite and a Canaanite. So all three of these things have been referred to as a bastard situation. Most of the scholars seem to lean toward a child born either out of incest or out of adultery that's being talked about here. So this restriction would discourage the Israelites from marrying Canaanites, since their children could not participate in public worship and public worship events and these were really important to the children of Israel. So this was kind of a warning or a situation where they would heavily discourage this because they didn't want their offspring to be in this situation. And it said, it uses the phrase here, "not even in the 10th generation," and this kind of precludes the possibility of them ever being received, because we've talked about this lots of times. The number 10 is a complete number. So, to the 10th generation would talk about a total exclusion of these children from the situation. Now, according to some of the ancient Jewish writers, there were ways and means by which the children of these bastards could become legitimate and be purified. The way that would happen was that the bastard would marry a servant maid, and the child of that servant, if they became free, would be a free man and could be accepted into the fellowship. Another interesting thing here that read about a little bit is Jephthah appears to have been an objection to this, or a exception, because he, in Judges 1:11, he said that he was the son of a harlot. Well, that would kind of make him a bastard situation. But if you read the text closely, he was actually the offspring of his father and one of his father's concubines, which was a little bit different situation than the situation you run into where you would have just somebody that there was no relationship to, and somebody who was born of strangers or not an Israelite. So some of the scholars have pointed to that as an objection, but I think if you read the whole text, you'll see that's not an issue.
Well, just 2 chapters ago, kind of dealt with this issue too, about running into Canaanite women, and just kind of refresh your memory. I'll read a couple of verses. This is Deuteronomy 21. I'm going to look at 10 through 13. It says, "When you go out to war against your enemies, the Lord your God delivers them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and desire her, and will take her for your wife, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall put off the clothes of her captivity, remain in your house, and mourn her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife." I see that kind of establishes where you make them an Israelite. You've got to go through a process.
Purification.
Yeah, purification.
Any other comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verses 3 through 6. An Amorite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah. Even to their 10th generation they shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water in the way when you came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor of Pethra of Mesopotamia to curse you. But Jehovah your God would not listen to Balaam, but Jehovah your God turned the curse to a blessing to you, because Jehovah your God loved you. You shall not seek their peace nor posterity all your days forever. So the Israelites under no circumstances were to admit an Amorite or a Moabite into the public worship or into any of the things that had to do with the ceremonial law. Now the Amorites and the Moabites were descendants of Lot through his incestuous relationship with his daughters. And the main reason for the exclusion of the Amorites and the Moabites was the extreme hostility that these nations demonstrated toward Israel when the Israelites were approaching the Promised Land. So evidently Ammon participated with Moab in the resistance of Israel's passage through, and in seeking cure the Israelites with Balaam's assistance, and they were trying to corrupt the Israelites through through prostitution and things along that line. Numbers 22 through 25 talk about this in pretty good detail, and we're not going to go and study 3 books or 3 chapters of that today. So according to the book of Numbers, Balak the king of Moab sent messengers to Pethor to meet with Balaam in order to elicit the curse upon the Israelite people who had left Egypt and were approaching Moab to occupy the land. So Balaam required the messengers to stay overnight in Pethor and to await his response the next morning. So there was a conspiracy here. It was against God's people, and God was not going to put up with that. And that was a situation where it went on for generations and generations. It wasn't going to happen because God was very displeased with the actions of those people. Any comments about that verse and those verses?
It was accepted eventually. A lady named Ruth.
Later on. All right, let's look at verses 7 and 8. You shall not despise an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not despise an Egyptian, because you were a stranger in his land. The sons that are born to them shall enter into the congregation of Jehovah in their 3rd generation. So God treated the Edomites and the Egyptians less severely than he did the other group. Now the great-grandchildren of the people from these nations could become public worshipers with the Israelites. They would be proselytes. And the rationale for this again is Israel's relation to these 2 nations in the history there. So the children are begotten of them, so they have the opportunity to become a proselyte. Now the charge is that this is to be done in the 3rd generation. Not in the 3rd generation from the time that the law was made, but from the time of any of them should embrace the true religion. So their sons were the 2nd generation, and their grandchildren were the 3rd generation, and such might be admitted into the congregation. And they were reckoned that both their civil and their church state, and they were capable of serving even as officers among the people, and they were also eligible to marry within the Israelite state. Now the Targum of Jonathan says, which some of the Jews interpreted of males only, for females according to them might be buried immediately as soon as they were made proselytes. And that's kind of what Bill was talking about in the verses that he read, and which they account for the lawfulness of Solomon's marriage to to Pharaoh's daughter. So there's a lot of, there's consistency in everything that we're talking about here, as far as your relations with, with other nationalities and things along that line, to make sure that the children of Israel are kept pure. Any comments or questions about those verses?
The scholarship says that the reason that you wait in the third generation seems to be that the Egyptians or Edomites that lived among them needed to maybe prove themselves.
Mm-hmm.
If they had proved themselves, that third generation, as the scripture says in verse 8, could enter into it simply because the family had been
right. And we've also got to keep in mind, we've talked about this a lot. Bill's mentioned, this is all prior. This has all been said prior to them entering the promised land. This is setting them up for go to the promised land. All right. In verses 23, or chapter 23, verses 9 through 14, we're going to talk about personal hygiene. And I couldn't help but reading this. I wish Jeff was here, because we'll talk a little bit about Boy Scouts. Back in the dark ages, I was actually in the Boy Scouts and reading this brings back a lot of the things that our troop leader used to tell us all the time. And we'll talk about that as we go through. So let's look at verse 9. When the army goes forth against your enemies, then keep yourselves from every wicked thing. So the army of soldiers, when they march, they need to be in tip-top shape so that they can meet and fight the enemy and defeat the enemy. So one of the key things here is to keep them away from every wicked thing. And if you look at some of the ancient writings, again, going back to the Targum of Jonathan, he talks about staying away from strange worship, staying out of the bed with other women. He talks about shedding innocent blood. He talks about the uncleanness of the body in all sorts of ways. He talks about murder and pretty much any type of wickedness they need to stay away from while they're doing battle. And if you think about, back through history, and some of the great wars that were fought, some wars, there were disease killed more people than the war did. And in the military today, there's an emphasis on personal hygiene and staying clean and things along that line. So soldiers in battle, if in the eyes of God, if they had sinned or they had some type of natural or some type of weakness, that could affect them in battle. These types of things weaken natural courage, and it because it kind of loads the consciousness with guilt, and you can't concentrate on what you're doing. So since victory and success, which depends upon the blessings of God in this situation, because every time the children of Israel went into battle, they were the attacker, and they were a smaller army. So they had to have God's blessing with them in order for them to succeed. And we've talked about in the past times when they went against God's will and they did something and they were utterly defeated. So, it was important that they follow these things and they eliminate these vices and indulgence so that they can, number one, stay pure in the sight of God, and number two, be able to do their job properly. Now, the bodily appearance of the people was also to correspond with the sacredness of Israel as the congregation of the Lord, especially when they gathered together around the Lord. So everything from personal hygiene to personal appearance was important. And all that talks about is one basic thing that you have to have is discipline. In any type of organization, military organization, police department, fire department, EMS, any type of first responders, discipline is one of the most important things. And if you don't have discipline, you're not going to have a good organization. And this is what we're talking about here, is having a disciplined army. So let's look at verse 10. If there is among you any man who is not clean because of an accident at night, then he shall go outside the camp, and he shall not come inside the camp. So basically what we're talking about here is if somebody has an accident at night, and they wake up. They need to go outside the camp. They don't want to pollute the camp. So this is a basic thing about cleanliness. And as we go through this, we're going to talk about how to keep your camp clean and how to keep your camp sterile so you don't have dysentery and things along that line. That's what we're talking about here. Now, there was nothing shameful about excrement in and of itself. We all have it. Can't do nothing about it. Okay, what goes in must come out type of situation. Okay, the problem is that you have to deal with it properly. And that's what God is talking about here, is that you don't do your business in your foxhole. Okay? You go someplace else away from your foxhole and you do your business. And it sounds like something that's a simple thing, but sometimes it gets a little complicated. And the Lord does not want his people doing their business inside of the camp. So let's look at verses 11 through 13. And it shall be an evening turns, he shall wash with water, and when the sun is down, he shall come into the middle of the camp. You shall also have a place outside the camp where you shall go forth, and you shall have a paddle on your weapon, and it shall be when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it, and shall turn back and cover that which comes from you. So basically what we're talking about here is, number one, after the battle and after the day, they need to clean themselves up and keep themselves clean, get away from the germs and all that kind of stuff. And second of all, they need to properly deal with their bodily functions. And I can remember when I was in Boy Scouts, like I say, back in the dark ages, we had a rule that if you did a number one, it was 100 feet downstream. If you did a number two, it was 200 feet downstream. Now, if there wasn't any stream and you're up on top of the hill, it was still 100 feet or 200 feet. Okay? And you went out, and normally when we would set up camp, somebody, usually the youngest guy, would get the job of taking the shovel and going 200 feet away and digging the privy hole. And you'd have your dirt already there, you'd have your shovel there, you'd have your toilet paper there. Okay, and it would be a place where you could go and do your business. The reason for being downstream was so that if you were doing it near a stream, you didn't pollute your water supply. So if you did it upstream, there's a possibility of polluting your water supply and getting dysentery and stuff like that. And here's the same principles that God is telling his soldiers here, is to go and dig a hole. When you get finished doing your business, you cover the hole. And the other thing that I remember too was that if you had biodegradable toilet paper, you could bury it with the excrement. If you didn't have biodegradable toilet paper, you had to bring it back with you and put it in the fire. That was another rule that that we had.
And what it talks about here, the first phrase in verse 13 also perfectly describes that little trenching
tool. Yeah.
Trenching shovel, which that's used for that camps.
Still is. Yeah. So basically, we're talking here about personal hygiene. It may appear trifling, but when you get a group of people together, it's really important. And the more people you have together in the group, the more important that all of these, that all of these things are. And I know that there were times at encampment where we would get somebody that would have a problem taking a shower. And after about the second day, you started smelling them coming down in formation. And normally about that evening, they were going to go to the shower one way or another, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell you a funny story. We were at the K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base. We were getting ready to leave, and we were on a real tight time frame. And one of the cadets came up, and you could smell him coming down the hall. And we gave him one of two choices: either go take a shower or walk home. And so he finally went and took a shower because nobody wanted to be on the plane with him. Because Mark will tell you it's uncomfortable on a C-130 when you got somebody that stinks the high heavens because the ventilation system's not the greatest in the world. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. So Moses is given these instructions, and it's not only a situation for the soldiers, but this is something that everybody can apply in a situation where you've got a big group together, because there are a lot of serious health problems that can come from a situation like this.
Was it that part of the reason? I don't know what years it was, maybe way back over in Europe. I mean, when they had so many diseases in all the big towns and everything.
It was running in the streets.
I gave them these instructions, but yet here they weren't doing it, and look what happened.
Right.
They had terrible problems at the end of World War II that had to be dealt with by the U.S. and the British military.
Mm-hmm.
All the sanitation services in Germany were just broken down.
And people don't think about this stuff. It's just like the health departments are very big on septic tanks. There's a reason for that, because nobody wants to have open sewer running in front of their houses. And the other thing that people don't think about, especially if you're on a well, okay, that septic tank, if it's not a certain distance from the well, will pollute your well. And, it can cause a lot of health problems that you may not know about. So, this cleanliness and decency here is to promote health and to prevent diseases. And this is, in a war situation, this is just absolutely critical.
I can just imagine if this were the standard today, they'd be hard to, with our short attention spans and things, it'd be hard to kind of absent yourself from the camp for the entire day.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this is saying here. Mm-hmm. You're going to go outside for the entire day, mm-hmm. clean yourself, clean your clothing. Then when the sun sets, which in their minds is the start of a new day,
right?
Good.
Well, and we're also here talking about diarrhea is what we're talking about in some of these cases. So you've got to get that cleaned up too. Any other comments or questions about those verses? All right, let's look at verse 14 and kind of continue in this. For Jehovah your God walks in the middle of your camp to deliver you and to give up your enemies before you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, so that he may see no unclean thing in you and turn away from you. So here's the deal. You may be able to hide this from your comrades, but you're not going to hide it from God. And this is not a suggestion. This is a command from God through Moses. So this is something that is not to be taken lightly, because I think everyone in leadership of the Israelites understood the problems with getting God on your bad side. They had seen it. They're going to see it. They've seen it in the past. And they're going to see it. They're going to see it in the future. So this is something that is not trifling. It's deadly serious stuff because of the situation that the children of Israel were in. So that kind of finishes up that section of the about cleanliness. Now we're going to go through several different, I guess, mini subject here and how to deal with it. So let's look at verses 15 and 16. Ye shall not deliver to his master the servant who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you among you, and in that place which he, the Lord, and drive him out of the camp of, what went the wrong way, shall choose in one of your gates where it seems good to him, you shall not oppress him. So a slave who has escaped from his master to Israel was not to be given up or to be sent back, but to be allowed to dwell in the land wherever he might choose and not be oppressed. So the reference is to a slave who has fled to them from a foreign country on account of harsh treatment which he had received from his heathen master. And the slaves from other nations who fled to Israel for refuge should receive permanent asylum. And that's pretty much what we're talking about here. And God's people were to show compassion to the oppressed, and we're not to join with the oppressors. In other words, you're not to mistreat these slaves who have run away. And the law here clarifies what the proper association with and how these people are to be treated. And slavery in that day and time was a big thing, and there was a lot of slaves out there. And if they escaped from their masters or whatever you want to call them, and were treating them bad, then they were supposed to be accepted and were treated humanely and with compassion by the children of Israel. Comments about those verses? How much time I got left, Keith?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay, well, let's try 2 more verses here then. Look at 17 and 18. There shall be no harlot of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the price of a dog into the house of Jehovah your God for any vow, for even both these are hateful to Jehovah your God. So the Hebrew term here used to describe harlot, there's actually 2 different terms that's used in the Old Testament, and one of them is Qedesa, and the other one is Qades. Both of these deal with harlots and prostitutes, but it deals with 2 different types of harlots and prostitutes. And as we read this, it's important that we separate the 2. Now, not only was there prostitutes, female prostitutes, but there were male sodomites or prostitutes also, and there was 2 different words used for them. One of them was Zonah, and the other was Keleeb. Now, the word for Qedesa is has a connotation that this is a holy prostitute. Now, that may sound kind of weird to have a holy prostitute, but what these prostitutes were, these were prostitutes at the temples of these false gods. And the same deal with the male prostitutes. There were male prostitutes at these temples. And what we're talking about here is, God does not want, number one, to be around these people, and number two, He doesn't want any money that would come about from this type of prostitution to be offered to Him or to be used here.
That's dirty money.
It's absolutely dirty money. One of the ones that was mentioned in some of the readings that I did, it talks about the temple of Venus at Corinth. Very rich temple there. And there was more than 1,000 what they called sacred or holy harlots. And they were men and women, and they were devoted to the goddess. And they were basically there to service, I guess you would say, the people who came to worship there at the temple of Venus.
Baal worship was known for this,
right?
As was the worship of the goddess Ashtaroth. So in that pre-Venus temple,
right?
That's more in the time of being where this has been written.
So we'll come back and talk about these verses a little bit more next week. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.